Hello, and welcome back, everyone. Now, I know I'm pretty late to the party, but I'm finally here to talk about The Sheep Detectives. Now, I'm not one of those who read the novel first. Rather, after I watched the movie and cried like a baby, I thought of picking up the novel. Yeah, the Hugh Jackman-starring comedy mystery is actually based on a 2005 novel by Leonie Swann titled 3 Bags Full, a sheep detective story. In fact, the film was originally developed under the title 3 Bags Full, a sheep detective movie, before it was renamed The Sheep Detectives. However, as with any adaptation, the film brought in multiple alterations to the original story before putting it up on the big screen. The writer, Craig Mazin, is an Agatha Christie nerd, and that's exactly why you'll find so many Christie-esque whodunit moments in the film. According to an interview Mazin gave to The Hollywood Reporter, most of the elements of the mystery in the novel couldn't quite be ported over. Mazin had to create a different engine and try to do as much of the Agatha Christie math as he could. See, those who were familiar with the novel would know that its overall tone was a little dark to be turned into a family film, and interestingly, this is one movie where I genuinely appreciated the creative liberties and changes made because they were needed, unlike, the Thursday Murder Club. Let's get into it right away. The very setting of the movie was different. According to Swann's vision, the story was set in the Irish village of Glenkill, where George Glen was a shepherd who was estranged from his wife and lived a largely solitary life. The thing that he was most fond of was his sheep, and he'd read them romance novels, adventure stories, fairy tales, detective stories, and textbooks about sheep diseases. He also promised to take them to Europe one day, while the sheep pictured Europe as a meadow filled with apple trees. However, Mazin traded the Irish setting for the fictional English village of Den Brook, where George Hardy spent his time reading murder mystery novels to his flock of sheep. Here, too, he had a deep attachment to his flock, but his surname, location, and the main kind of stories he read were all changed. Mazin was so determined to make the movie feel like we were living in an Agatha Christie world that he chose murder mystery books over the novel's broader selection of reading material. He told The Hollywood Reporter, "If this is gonna be a whodunit and all they knew about the world is whodunits from Agatha Christie, well, it should be an Agatha Christie whodunit. It should follow those rules. The thing is, Agatha Christie's Miss Marple and Hercule Poirot don't solve the case until the very end. They struggle, and I love that struggle." The darker themes were removed. The original novel was much darker than what director Kyle Balder portrayed. On the surface, The Sheep Detectives has been described as Babe meets Knives Out, but the movie also had a sensitive emotional and philosophical core that made us all reach for the tissue boxes. For starters, George's apparent murder was much more violent in the novel, as his body was found pinned to the ground with a spade. Moreover, the sheep in the book were not versed in murder mysteries. They were much more clueless about the human world, particularly police work, and were far more hesitant to interact with humans. The book also dealt with adult concepts like drug trafficking, as George secretly used the sheep to transport marijuana. Movie George, meanwhile, was deliberately made much more sympathetic because the filmmakers had barely 12 minutes to make us fall in love with him and root for the flock after his death. Moreover, the sheep in the film were already familiar with mystery stories and were somewhat more aware of how investigations were supposed to work. In the end, 3 Bags Full told a much darker and more morally complicated story, using sheep as a tool to explore the human world from a completely different perspective. But the movie reshaped it because Mazin believed the basic goal when I started was to write a movie that literally anyone could watch, anyone on the planet, regardless of religion, politics, gender, nationality. It's for humans, so when you aim for humans, you have to do things that are appropriate. Mazin also explained the mystery itself is quite different. Leonie Swann's novel, which is wonderful, isn't necessarily what I would call The result is maybe not necessarily an all audiences kind of solution. So, because this movie really is for everyone, I changed the nature of the whodunit quite a bit. But in the end, that's not what's as important as why it happened, and how the sheep rise to the challenge and grow. The ending was much more grim in the book. See, the crux of the story remained the same. The sheep came together to investigate the sudden, unexplained death of their shepherd, and although the sheep in the book were much more inexperienced than their film counterparts, they did use some pretty impressive detective skills to uncover the truth about George's death. They were led by Miss Maple, who considered herself the cleverest sheep in all of Glenkill and encouraged the flock to investigate. But how did they do so in the book if they were not familiar with whodunits? Well, the sheep began by eavesdropping on the villagers' conversations through open windows. However, since they didn't fully understand human speech and customs, they often became confused and misinterpreted things, such as believing the local priest was named God. They also came across physical clues, while the stories that George had read to them helped Miss Maple think through human motives, whose name, by the way, is remarkably similar to Christie's Miss Marple, although the novel does not definitively establish that it was intended as a direct homage. The sheep eventually became convinced that Beth, a deeply religious woman who had once been close to George, knew something about his death. Taking inspiration from the dramatic stories that George had read, they reenacted his death during the Smartest Sheep in Glenkill contest in an attempt to expose the truth. Beth then confessed that George had come to her before his death and revealed that he intended to take his own life. After he died, Beth drove the spade through his body at his request, making his death appear to be murder. The movie, however, changed George's death into an actual murder committed by his estranged son, Peter Van Vuren, a character who didn't exist in the novel. Though everyone initially believed that Peter lived in South Africa, it was finally revealed that he was none other than the overly friendly and curious reporter, Elliot Matthews. Peter had murdered George for his fortune, framed his twin sister Rebecca, and assumed a false identity to manipulate the investigation. The film therefore traded the novel's bleak revelation about suicide for a more conventional Christie-style killer reveal, suitable for a family mystery. Sheep. No more. The sheep cast was simplified. One of the most noticeable changes from Three Bags Full to the Sheep Detectives was the compression and reworking of the flock. Yeah, Swann's story had more sheep than those we met in the movie. All of them had distinct personalities and played unique roles in the investigation in the book, but the number of characters had to be simplified for the film. On the page, we had Miss Maple, the main detective brain, the forgetful but respected ram, Sir Richfield, and the mysterious black ram, Othello. We also had Mopple the whale, whose excellent memory was invaluable, just as Mopple's memory was in the movie. Then there was the thoughtful, adventurous ewe, Zora, and Sir Richfield's long-lost twin brother, Melmoth. The creators tried to retain as much as possible by combining or substantially altering several sheep. As a result, the film still had a sizable voice cast, including Julia Louis-Dreyfus, Chris O'Dowd, Bryan Cranston, Regina Hall, Patrick Stewart, Bella Ramsey, and Brett Goldstein. Yet, the adaptation had to reduce and reshape the flock to suit its 109-minute runtime. Screenwriter Craig Mazin explained that despite combining several sheep from the novel into single characters, others had to be omitted entirely. To quote him, "There were quite a few changes. I mean, the most important stuff was really, what did I need to keep? What did I insist must come through? And that was really obviously the basic concept, but the nature of the sheep and their innocence, and a lot of the characters, some of which we kinda combined into one." The movie also changed the central detective's name from Miss Maple to Lily, and introduced film-specific characters and backstories. The former carnival fighting sheep, Cloud, the sheep proud of her wool, Ronnie and Reggie, the head-butting twins, and the outcast, Winter Lamb. However, Lily still formed a strategic team of sheep detectives based on their personalities and skills. George was not exactly a lovable character in the novel. I already told you that George was involved in drug trafficking in the book, and it turns out that he was a far more morally compromised person than his film counterpart. Now, unlike in the movie where George and the butcher Ham were not exactly close on Swann's pages, the two were friends and partners in a long-running blackmail scheme. Years before the events of the novel began, a local property developer named Wesley Weasel McCarthy wanted to transform Glenkill through a development project that many villagers opposed. McCarthy was murdered, and several villagers worked together to create false alibis that concealed what had happened. George and Ham discovered McCarthy's body, and George managed to reconstruct the crime. To protect themselves and exploit the guilty villagers, George devised an elaborate blackmail scheme. Ham's butcher shop surveillance footage contradicted the villagers' fabricated alibis, and copies of the evidence were deposited with a lawyer, ensuring that the truth would be released if anything happened to George or Ham. That's exactly why the villagers were reluctant to challenge them openly. This subplot reshaped George's character and was removed from the film to avoid jeopardizing his warm, loving shepherd persona. Miss Maple eventually realized that the presentation of George's body was deliberately connected to McCarthy's murder, linking the two deaths. By removing the McCarthy storyline, the film eliminated much of the novel's moral complexity and focused on a more straightforward murder mystery centered on a single killer. George's wife was also removed from the movie. At the end of the movie, Rebecca learnt that the name of her birth mother was Lily, just like George's favourite sheep, and the one leading the investigation on screen. However, in the book, Lily was the name of George's former mistress, while he was estranged from his wife, Kate. Kate was described as a red-haired woman by Swann, and was a fascinating figure to the flock because the stories George read them often featured red-haired heroines, whom the sheep remembered under the name Pamela. However, there was another intriguing but mature concept at play here. Ham was also in love with Kate, and the woman had once been caught in a love triangle between the two men before deciding to marry George. Ham continued to pine for her after the marriage, and obsessively watched footage from his butcher shop surveillance camera in the hope of seeing her movements. Okay, creep alert. This relational tension, along with George's criminal activities and infidelity, contributed to the growing distance between George and Kate, who eventually lived separately. However, Kate still had a significant role after George's death. She visited Father William and revealed that George had left a will with a lawyer. When the priest suggested that Kate sell the flock to Ham, she refused. When villagers invaded the meadow and the sheep overheard gossip about George's fortune, they discovered more clues about his death. Maple even ventured to Kate's home and listened when George's former lover Lily arrived to offer her condolences, only for Kate to slam the door on her. Eventually, George's will left Kate his books and library. The film removed both Kate and the novel's Lily, instead making Lily the name of Rebecca and Peter's deceased mother, while giving the same name to the flock's lead detective. Ham's dark fate in the book. After George's death, Ham became the only surviving person who knew the complete truth about McCarthy's death and the blackmail scheme through which he and George had exploited the villagers' guilt. Now, when the sheep were snooping around to find clues about George's death, Othello was part of the investigation too. But because Othello was a black ram with a mysterious past, Ham began to view him as a frightening or supernatural presence. Poor Ham became convinced that he was being haunted or punished for holding the truth about McCarthy and benefiting from the blackmail scheme. One day, Ham became increasingly unhinged with paranoia and attempted to seize Mopple. During the pursuit through the mist, Ham fell from a cliff and was left severely injured and paralyzed. For Mopple, who was terrified of Ham because he was a butcher who slaughtered sheep, the confrontation also became a moment in which he stood up to his greatest fear. The film retained a butcher named Ham Gilead, but gave him a completely different role. Movie Ham secretly collaborated with the neighbouring shepherd Caleb Merrow to slaughter sheep. Lily and Mopple discovered their operation, and the resulting chase led to Sebastian sacrificing himself to protect them. The film therefore replaced Ham's paranoid downfall with a more direct threat to the flock, and used the storyline to teach Lily the reality of death. Tim Derry was an original creation for the film. The clumsy local police officer Tim Derry, who became smitten with Rebecca shortly after she arrived, was an original addition to the movie. Over time, Tim learnt to deduce the clues, albeit with a lot of help from the sheep, and in the end had his moment by identifying Elliot Matthews as Peter Van Vuren, the real killer. Tim, played by Nicholas Braun, acted as a comedic element in the film, but also ended up adding an emotional layer when he gradually took the sheep's behaviour seriously and used their clues to solve the mystery. However, instead of the warm and funny Tim Derry, the book had another investigator whose character was quite different, Inspector Holmes. And no, his surname had very little to do with his detective skills. Holmes was unable to solve the year-old case of McCarthy's murder and came across as a generally decent but hesitant investigator rather than a hard-boiled detective. He was equally puzzled by the villagers' secrets and the unusual circumstances surrounding George's death, and he lacked the intuition associated with classic fictional detectives, which is why the flock often outthought him. Swann used Holmes partly as a satire of crime fiction conventions, as he was closer to a confused ordinary policeman than a Sherlock-style mastermind. This made the contrast between the official police investigation and the Sheep's amateur detective work much more entertaining. Near the end of the novel, Holmes received the surveillance tapes connected to McCarthy's murder and was effectively handed the evidence needed to solve that older case. Other missing human characters. Just like the Sheep, many human characters from Swann's novel were also removed or substantially replaced in the film. For instance, Josh Baxter, the landlord of the Mad Boar pub, was nowhere in the movie. The Sheep enacted George's death at the pub during a public gathering, and Josh was interested in expanding Glenkill's tourist trade because it would have benefited him financially, an idea George had opposed. George wanted to keep the village and its secrets closed off, rather than opening its doors to curious outsiders. Another character present in the book was Tom O'Malley, an alcoholic who discovered George's body. He was also one of the first humans to understand that George's sheep were attempting to act out the circumstances of his death, despite frequently being drunk. There was also a mysterious, unnamed man whom the sheep recognized by smell and called the Master Hunter. His exact identity and activities remained deliberately unclear, although he appeared connected to George's criminal world and may have been involved in drug trafficking. The film replaced or redistributed the functions of many of these characters among its new cast. Beth became a pub owner rather than the book's religious Beth Jameson. Lydia Harbottle became George's solicitor. Caleb Merrow became a neighbouring shepherd and threat to the sheep, while reporter Elliot and Officer Tim carried most of the human investigation. The joke about Return to Oz. Okay, this one's a tiny detail compared to the others, but worth mentioning. The movie included a reference to the long-remembered 1985 fantasy sequel to The Wizard of Oz, starring Fairuza Balk, Return to Oz. The villagers were astonished when the overly eager journalist Elliot claimed to have never heard of the movie and explained his supposed connection to the area. The exchange was a film-only joke and had no counterpart in Three Backs Full. It helped establish Denbrook as the kind of eccentric, insular English village whose residents share obscure local knowledge and are suspicious of outsiders like Elliot. The joke also fitted the movie's larger pattern of adding comedic dialogue, British cultural references, and village eccentricities that weren't present in Swann's original Irish set mystery. Alright guys, that's all for today. I honestly enjoyed both the book and the movie, though the book sometimes felt a little sluggish at points because, well, after every unsheepish thing the flock did, they'd stop to eat grass. Nonetheless, Mazin and Boulder's take was absolutely delightful, and given that there's a sequel to the book titled Guru, published in English as Three Bags Full, a sheep detective story follow-up under different regional titles, we might be in for a follow-up movie. When Mazin was asked whether he'd want to write a sequel, he replied, "I feel like maybe I'll leave this one just as it is. Maybe somebody else will take a turn at it. I don't know. I love this one so much that I'm not sure I want to push my luck." Let's just hope that if anyone picks it up, they do justice to the first film, because boy, have I become a fan of Lily, the detective mastermind, and the uber-cute winter lamb. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the bell icon, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.